For a long time, banks occupied a strange place in British life. They weren't loved exactly, but they were trusted, quietly trusted, the sort of institutions people rarely thought about unless something went wrong. You opened an account, your pension arrived every month, the bills were paid, and life carried on with a kind of predictable rhythm. And I think many people assumed that rhythm was permanent, that whatever happened politically, economically, culturally, your bank account remained yours. But recently, that assumption has started to feel less solid. Across parts of the UK, pensioners are being warned that certain bank accounts could face restrictions, temporary freezes, or sudden security reviews this June. Some of the warnings are administrative, some relate to identity checks, dormant account investigations, fraud prevention measures, or updated compliance rules, and on paper, much of it sounds entirely reasonable. Banks argue they are trying to protect vulnerable customers from scams, financial abuse, and increasingly sophisticated cybercrime. Yet the public reaction tells a different story, because what people hear is not always the technical explanation. What they hear is uncertainty. They hear that access to money they depend on could suddenly become complicated, delayed, interrupted, and for pensioners, particularly those already living carefully from one payment cycle to the next, that fear lands differently. You can almost feel the anxiety underneath the headlines. It's not just about banking procedures, it's about stability, about whether ordinary people still feel secure inside systems that once promised reliability. And honestly, I keep coming back to how fragile that sense of trust has become in Britain over the past few years. The country has lived through economic shocks, political turbulence, rising energy bills, inflation that reshaped household budgets almost overnight, and a cost of living crisis that changed how millions think about money. For many pensioners, retirement no longer feels like a period of rest. It feels like constant calculation, heating or groceries, petrol or medication, small decisions carrying enormous emotional weight. So when reports emerge suggesting accounts could be frozen pending verification checks or suspicious activity reviews, even temporarily, people do not experience that as routine administration. They experience it emotionally, personally, and maybe that's the point policymakers sometimes miss. Because institutions often speak in procedural language while the public experiences consequences in human terms. A bank may describe an account freeze as a standard compliance measure, but to an elderly customer waiting for pension payments, it can feel frighteningly immediate. It can mean standing at a supermarket checkout unable to pay. It can mean worrying through an entire weekend before customer support lines reopen on Monday morning. The thing people are starting to notice is how automated so much of modern life has become. Decisions once handled by human judgment increasingly happen through systems, algorithms, security flags, and risk assessments operating quietly in the background. Efficient perhaps, but also impersonal, and sometimes deeply opaque. There's this growing feeling that ordinary people are being asked to navigate institutions that no longer really see them. And I think pensioners feel that especially strongly because many grew up during a very different era of banking, an era where local branches mattered, where managers knew customers by name, where there was at least the illusion of personal familiarity. Now branches disappear year after year, replaced by apps, automated messages, chatbots, and distant call centers. Of course, some would argue this transformation is unavoidable. Banks are under enormous pressure to combat fraud. Financial scams targeting elderly people have become increasingly sophisticated, and regulators expect institutions to intervene quickly when suspicious activity appears. Supporters of stricter controls say temporary account restrictions can prevent devastating financial losses, and they are not entirely wrong. The UK has seen a sharp rise in online fraud, impersonation scams, and criminal exploitation targeting vulnerable individuals. In that environment, banks face impossible calculations, act too slowly and customers lose life savings, act too quickly and innocent people feel punished by systems they barely understand. It's strange because both fears can exist at the same time. People want protection, but they also want dignity. They want security without feeling monitored or powerless. And perhaps what unsettles many pensioners is not simply the possibility of account freezes, but the broader feeling that control over everyday life has become increasingly conditional. Conditional on paperwork being updated correctly, conditional on passing verification checks, conditional on systems functioning exactly as intended. For younger generations raised inside digital bureaucracy, maybe this feels normal, frustrating certainly, but familiar. Yet for many older Britons, the pace of change has been profoundly disorientating. Banking, healthcare, government services, even social interaction increasingly require technological fluency that not everyone possesses equally. And the conversation seems to be shifting towards something larger than banking itself. Because underneath these stories sits a deeper national question about aging, dignity, and visibility. Britain is growing older as a society. Millions of pensioners contributed decades of work into systems they believed would provide security later in life. Now some feel they are navigating institutions designed more for efficiency than reassurance. You hear it in conversations at post offices, pharmacies, supermarkets, not necessarily anger, more exhaustion, a quiet sense that ordinary tasks have become unnecessarily difficult, that systems once built around people now expect people to adapt endlessly to systems. And honestly, there's something emotionally revealing about that. The debate around frozen accounts touches a nerve because money is never just money, particularly for older people. It represents independence, competence, privacy, the ability to function without relying on children, neighbors, or strangers. So when access to finances suddenly feels uncertain, even briefly, it can trigger something much deeper than inconvenience, a loss of confidence, a fear of dependency, a sense of vulnerability that many people try very hard to hide. And maybe politicians underestimate how politically significant these emotions can become. Pensioners remain one of the most engaged voting groups in Britain. They notice institutional changes quickly because many interact directly with public systems every single day: banks closing branches, GP surgeries moving online, public transport becoming more expensive, telephone services disappearing behind automated menus. Individually, each change seems manageable. Collectively, they create an atmosphere where older citizens increasingly feel pushed toward the margins of modern life while being told everything is more convenient than before. Of course, defenders of the banking sector would say fears are sometimes exaggerated online. Most account reviews are resolved quickly. Many warnings simply encourage customers to update identification documents or remain alert against scams. And statistically speaking, widespread permanent freezes remain relatively uncommon. That context matters, but perception matters too. And what's interesting is how quickly public confidence can erode once people begin imagining worst-case scenarios, particularly after years where trust in major institutions has already weakened. Parliament, utilities, media, policing, even the NHS, once almost untouchable in public affection, now faces scrutiny and frustration unimaginable a generation ago. Banks are entering that same emotional territory, not hated exactly, but no longer unquestioningly trusted. And I think this reflects something broader happening across Western societies. Systems designed for scale and efficiency increasingly struggle to provide reassurance, humanity, or patience. People feel processed rather than understood, managed rather than listened to. The language becomes technical while the experience becomes emotional. That disconnect matters more than politicians sometimes realize, because once people begin feeling alienated from institutions meant to protect them, they start retreating into suspicion. Rumors spread faster, fear becomes easier to trigger, every warning letter feels threatening, every policy adjustment feels personal and social. Trust, once damaged, is remarkably difficult to rebuild. So perhaps the real story here is not simply whether some pensioners might temporarily lose access to accounts this June. It's what that fear reveals about the national mood. A country increasingly uncertain about who modern systems are truly designed for. A country where many older citizens feel simultaneously protected and abandoned. Protected by safeguards, abandoned by complexity. And maybe that contradiction defines modern Britain more than politicians would like to admit, because the technology grows more advanced while public confidence grows more fragile. Institutions become smarter, faster, more automated, yet many people feel less secure inside them than ever before, and I think that emotional contradiction is going to shape politics for years to come. Not through dramatic revolutions or sudden upheaval, but through quieter shifts, growing distrust, growing fatigue, a slow erosion of confidence between citizens and institutions that once formed the invisible architecture of everyday life. The question now is whether Britain can modernize without making millions of ordinary people feel left behind in the process. And honestly, listening to the anxieties surrounding these banking warnings, I'm not entirely sure the country has answered that question yet. There's another layer to this as well, and I don't think it gets discussed often enough. Many pensioners remember a Britain built around physical presence. You went somewhere to solve problems, you spoke to someone directly, there was comfort in that ritual, even when systems were imperfect. Now reassurance itself feels digitized. Instructions arrive through automated emails, security alerts appear without explanation, helplines place callers into endless recorded queues, and for people already feeling isolated, that experience can feel strangely cold. What's fascinating is that younger generations often accept this trade-off almost automatically: convenience in exchange for distance, speed in exchange for personal contact. but older people tend to notice what disappeared along the way, the small human interactions that once softened bureaucracy, the ability to look somebody in the eye and explain your situation. And maybe this is why these warnings resonate so deeply. They symbolize something bigger than banking. They symbolize a society becoming harder to navigate for the people who helped build it, not intentionally cruel, just increasingly indifferent. And perhaps the real challenge for Britain now is deciding whether efficiency alone is enough to hold a society together once trust, familiarity, and human connection begin quietly fading from public life. Because people can tolerate inconvenience surprisingly well when they feel respected, what they struggle with is the sense that systems no longer recognize their fears or humanity, and in moments like this, that emotional distance suddenly becomes impossible to ignore for millions watching.